non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where we welcome converts, but where we think like disciples. I can hardly believe it. This is the last episode of my 4th year of doing the UU cast of the pod. 4 years, 233 public episodes, and tons of mistakes made through my podcasting time. I'm so not a techie guy. But it's been both more work than I originally anticipated and more rewarding. I'm grateful for every download and listen, every person who thinks with me, even if you disagree. So again, thanks. Thanks for being willing to go deeper than thanks for being willing to go a little thicker than a bumper sticker. I like that, thicker than a sticker. This show is, increasingly subversive. I didn't start out with that intention, but in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. My mere weekly act of podcasting truth is itself subversive. But there's a broader reason, and I want to frame it for you. Right up until about the mid-1990s, when the internet started, the flow of information was controlled by the mass media. Today, sometimes they're known as the legacy media or the mainstream media, right? Radio, TV, newspapers. It was a monopoly, and they controlled what people knew about what was going on, controlled what people knew about politics and politicians and political scandals, or not. Man, they comprised a Leviathan. That's fun. We're gonna get to Leviathan in the book of Job in today's episode. But those news media were a giant eating, consuming production. They spoke out against governmental abuse, statist overreach, or not. They held leaders and authors and celebrities accountable, or not. They reported on church news, religious news, intentionally shaped people's worldviews, or not. And their integrity? Not. Why is that? Why don't they have much integrity? 'Cause they bow their knee to the market, to making money, and not the truth. The truth is not necessarily their first concern. Oh, thank you for that little tidbit, Mom. But all of that was done according to their values, their goals, their own wiring and telos. Now, today, there are much more media. And that includes podcasts like mine, a show given over to both thinking about and thinking through a Christian worldview. That's something the mainstream media would not only would never have allowed, it's something that they, at least for all of my life, have loathed. So, the mere production of my podcast is subversive. Subversive to the nakedly secular worldview of the legacy media, subversive to progressives who want, biblically speaking, with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, to control the thinking. You guys, the culture wars are at root. Battles about what people think. They wanted, with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength, to control the narrative, the public discourse. So my show's subversive to the powers of darkness that would relish having a monopoly on human thought. And now they can't. There's too much variety, too much access, too much freedom of thought. And until they figure out how to either unilaterally censure lovers of truth or shut down the internet altogether, we will continue being subversive. It's our calling in Christ. You see, my keen-minded listener, here's the problem I became acutely aware of, about 25 years ago. If your worldview and values are not shaped at church by keen-minded Christians through the Word of God, if your evaluating filter is not shaped by Christ's wisdom through discipleship, If your lenses for doing life are not attuned to the vibration of the Holy Spirit through a biblical worldview and the affections of Jesus and the truth of God Himself, you will be attuned by culture. There's no alternative. It's Christ or not. I mean, I like to think in shades of gray and nuance, but this is fairly binary. It's fairly direct and stark, and it's why much of the church is effete, wispy, silly, and finally, oh mercy, finally it's increasingly meaningless to millions who otherwise want to believe. And millions of self-confessing believers, they do not have the mind of Christ. They do not evaluate or prioritize or strategize about life in light of the crucified Christ. They pay no heed to a biblical worldview. They process and live and do almost entirely following the constructs of our postmodern culture. And how else could they? Their churches won't talk about what it means to evaluate through Christ. Their pastors are terrified to speak to cultural matters. Their leaders blithely ignore the sculpting effect of culture. Me, as a some 2 decades long theology professor, I've come to realize that culture is far more powerful than a student's youth group church experience. Culture is far more influential than a student's week-long elation at summer camp. Culture is far more soul-shaping than that they for a few years listen to Christian worship music in their earbuds. And so, shaped by a pomo culture, they evaluate and marry and vote and hang and shop and parent and think, holy, holy God, they think like the godless. And I'm less angry in saying all this and more I'm sounding a lament. When I was a professor, nothing was so heartbreaking to me as to have a joyful young new freshman enter into some intro class of mine, and then 2 years later, they'd come back for a required junior level class, and they were bitter. Their joy was gone. Their once sweet disposition was turned sour. Their warm existential light was snuffed out by the angry nihilistic deconstructionism they were learning in most every class across the campus. They were at a Christian college, but they were having their faith shredded by not Christian professors. And the truth? Those students had no chance. They were led to the intellectual slaughter like baby lambs to the shooting pen. They hadn't dug deep anchors for their faith at church. They came to school with little to no reasoning for why they were a Christian or why it even mattered. And they were just intellectually machine gunned down. Faith destroyed, now angry at their parents, loathing traditional Christian constructs. They were leveled, empty, sad souls. And it broke my heart to witness year after year, student after student. Once vibrant hearts frozen cold by thinking that ran contrary to Christ's own character. So, me? Yeah, there's a good reason to be subversive. There is something at stake. Thinking is not less important because of the technology-rich world we live in. It is more important. Believers desperately need to challenge that old thought monopoly news machine and its bankrupt postmodern culture. And man, all that makes me doubly grateful that you want to process with me. Our time together is precious. Lord Jesus, we believe. Help our unbelief. Okay, more today about the book of Job. Like I said last episode, the whole Judeo-Christian world turns to the book of Job to understand suffering. goodness. When his three friends first showed up at his ranch, they were so overwhelmed with Job's distress that on the dirt they sat in silence for a solid 7 days. Chapter 2, verse 13. And after that week of silence, Job cursed the day he was born. He said, "Oh, that the night I was born were barren. Oh, that the doors of my mother's womb were shut tight." Chapter 3, verse 6 and 10. So, Job, now after some 3,500 years, is an archetype of suffering. Like you, I have friends who have suffered prolongedly, physically, mentally across their extended family, jobs lost, relationships crushed, and I frequently think, man, my friend is reliving the rotten story of Job. And so, because it is such an archetypal story, we disciples do well to understand it and what it's teaching. And by the way, if you would go and read 2 to 3 chapters of Job each day for the next 3 or 4 weeks, you'd track better what I'm going to say, make more sense of what I'm going to try to say in these episodes. Plus, then you can decide if what I'm saying makes sense. So, last week I talked about Job, the wife, the Satan, and the book's 2 main themes. This week I want to talk about his 3, air quotes, wise friends. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. These 3 foils, these types are important to understand because they establish 2 important things for us. A, what passed for wisdom in the ancient world, and B, what we, the readers, should not ourselves believe. So let's look at the 3 friends. First, Eliphaz. He talks to Job and says he had a dream where a spirit recounted to him the established wisdom that he's going to share with Job von Uz. And wise old dreaming Eliphaz? In his own long speeches, he tells Job, "Dude, you seem to have forgotten Wisdom 101. Wisdom 101 has always made clear the truths like the innocent are not cut off by God." Chapter 4, verse 7. And those who sow iniquity reap God's hot blast of anger. 4 verses 8 and 9. And the angels themselves are not perfect. How much more are mortals made of clay imperfect? We mortals ought never ever think we are pure before God. Chapter 4, 17 through 19. It is God's order that sinners suffer, just like it's the ordered nature of fire embers to rise up. Chapter 5, verses 6 and 7. Eliphaz says, "Job, have you so quickly forgotten that with God the rain falls on the just?" Chapter 5, verse 10. And that the crafty wicked are frustrated by God? Chapter 5, verse 12. So Job, quit your moaning. God is disciplining you. Chapter 5, 17 and 18. You so deserve what you're getting. Chapter 15, verse 2. Quit being so arrogant and God might let up on you. Chapter 15, verses 7 through 10. You lost your children and animals, Job, because you're godless. So you're getting what you deserve. Chapter 15, verses 34 through 35. Eliphaz is saying, Job, Job, this is Wisdom 101, basic wisdom. Everyone knows this stuff. So what is our author conveying to us through the speeches of Eliphaz? Well, he's telling us the even then long established and widely embraced Hebrew retribution principle. You reap what you sow. If you're suffering, you must have done something wrong. Now, my listener, it's sort of like the Pentecostal church I grew up in. If someone got sick or had something generally bad happen, the running crack, and it was half in joking, but it was half church theology, the running crack would be, well, there must be sin in your life. And geesh, it took me decades to recover from that way of thinking. Why was the retribution principle so widely embraced? Well, the first beauty of the retribution principle, it's easy to understand. Things don't happen just for no reason. Something causes things to happen. And if you can't discern why something bad is happening, it must be you. Or put that into more resolutely theological categories, the Hebrews rightly thought God is a just God. He doesn't punish the righteous. Job, his friends are telling him, Eliphaz is telling him, Job, clearly you're being disciplined and punished in light of the retribution principle. It must be God. And God is doing it because obviously you have sinned. The second beauty of the retribution principle, and I think this one may be just as important, it makes us think we are in control. And my, oh my, do we ever love control. Right? With the retribution principle and sowing and reaping, you can actually direct God's blessing by being good. You actually can reap bad karma and even God's punishment by being bad. So we cling to the retribution principle because we think it grants us control. Come here, God. I have a treat for you. Come here, sit down. Oh, that's a good boy. But Job's not buying what Eliphaz is selling. So Job says, hey, your dream is scary, old friend, chapter 7, verse 14, but you don't get it. Yes, I am feeling the poison of God's arrows, chapter 6, verse 4, and honestly, I'd rather be dead, chapter 6, verse 9. And on top of that, you, Eliphaz, you are wrong. Don't come here to comfort me and then heap shame on my head. Chapter 6, verse 21 and 25, chapter 7, verse 29. Yeah, thanks for nothing. Leave me alone so I can sit here and try to swallow my spit. Chapter 7, verse 19. And if we were the ancient listener hearing this tale, we'd be concerned. We'd be thinking together, whew, Job, you need to humble yourself and listen. Eliphaz told you the truth, time conveyed, time worn wisdom, wisdom 101. Don't be so hasty, Mr. Von Uz, with your strong rebuking words. You may be sowing still more sin in the eyes of God. So there's Job and the speeches around Eliphaz. Next, enter Bilbo Durbagans. I mean, Bildad the Shuhite. But first, I smile when folks help promote this thinking person's show. And it's so easy. Just copy and paste a URL link, Facebook, Libsyn, YouTube, iTunes. Put that into your social media post. Wham, bam, dunzo. Unfriends who've recently done just that? Gus C., Scott M., Daniel F., and Victor S. Thanks, sincerely, guys. Well, we're not surprised to learn that Eliphaz did not convince Job. So maybe Bildad can? And we encounter Bildad's long speeches in chapters 8 and 18. And what we get is more of the same. And reading his speeches, you wonder, didn't he just listen to Job's rejection of what Eliphaz has argued? What was Bildad thinking? Well, Job rejected my good friend Eliphaz's advice, but me, doggone it, I'm the esteemed Bildad of Shuhite. No one resists my keen insights. So Bildad says to Job things like, all our ancestors know this wisdom stuff, chapter 8, verse 8. And God is a just God who does right to the righteous, 8, verse 3. And if you just do good stuff, God would make you a great man, 8, verse 7. Job, the wicked walk into a net of their own making, 18, verse 8. Those who forget God perish. So, Job, don't forget God. like you obviously have. Chapter 8, verse 13. How does Job respond to Bildad? He says, Ahem, didn't I just refute this argument with Eliphaz? Who do you think you are, Bildad? I actually do understand God. I get that he can level mountains, chapter 9, verse 5. I recognize that he charts the sun's course, 9:6, shapes the constellations, chapter 9, verse 9. I know all that. But here's the dealio you seem to be overlooking, my diminutive Shuhite friend. I am blameless. I am innocent, chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. In fact, I'm quite aware of the retribution principle. I realize all that. And the truth is, God's punishing me without reason. God has put his switch to my backside without cause. Chapter 9, verse 34. Oh, I wish I had an umpire, chapter 9, verse 33, who would stand between me and God to assess this situation and make a call, because God's hunting me down like a lion, chapter 10, verse 16, and he sends his army to assault my body, chapter 10, verses 17 through 18. It's better that I had not been born, that I have to endure all this, chapter 10, verses 18 through 20. So our good Mr. Job von Uz, he was not convinced by the retribution principle being levied against him. Not one bit. The tension builds in the story. And then we have Zophar the Naamathite. Does he vary the strategy? Try another tack? Maybe go with a redirect to get Job to come to his senses? No. Here we have from our ancient author a third proponent of the principle of retribution. It's a veritable retribution trifecta. Why are you introducing a heathen gambling term, trifecta? The ancient author wants his readers to be clear. Here's what's at stake. The retribution principle is established wisdom, time-worn truth. And so, for the third time, a friend says to Job things like, through the mouth of Zophar, Zophar says, your constant babbling rejoinders against God only prove you're guilty of sin. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. And stupid folks like you actually understanding things are comparable to a wild ass giving birth to a human. Chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. So please just repent before God and he will make your life bright like the noonday sun. Chapter 11, verse 17. So there's a third time. The third time the same advice comes from yet another, air quotes, wise friend. Did it come along? Did all of that actually convince Job? Hardly. He responds to Zophar and says, hey, I know things too. Chapter 12, verse 3. And you guys, you just don't get it. I'm a blameless man. Chapter 12, verse 4. So God is afflicting me undeservedly so. Chapter 12, verse 7 through 10. My breath stinks. 19:17. And so far I have only escaped death by the skin of my teeth. Chapter 19, verse 20. I'm always amazed at how many turns of phrase in Western civilization go back to the Bible itself. Skin of my teeth. And even though, Job says, even though God is laying the wood to me, I will defend myself before him and be acquitted. Chapter 13, verse 13 and 18. If only, if only I could have an umpire, I would be vindicated. So all your words, Zophar, are like empty ashes. Chapter 13, verse 12. And with that, Job prays a prayer of lament to God. Oh God, you're being grossly unfair to me. In no way do I deserve this. If only I had an umpire, I would prove God wrong. You dudes, I know that my Redeemer lives. chapter 19, verse 25. And we should land on that verse for a minute. I know that my Redeemer lives, because it's a famous verse for Christian thinking. In its ancient setting, this is not an appeal to Jesus. It's not an appeal to some mediator who sits alongside God as God. This verse doesn't mean what Christians have taken it to mean, or what George Friedrich Handel made it to mean in his Messiah cantata. And oh, do I love the music to which he put that verse. The violins are just gorgeous. And we know all that because the Old Testament is barely even aware of the existence of the afterlife. I don't want to be self-referential, but please go listen to my episode number 53 regarding the intertestamental worldview shift, or go listen to number 52, the Old Testament on death and the afterlife. Job's cry for a redeemer is rhetorical. It's a plea from the author through Job for justice in the court of God. And Job thinks he's being so wrongly smoked in God's court that he's crying out for an umpire, a mediator. But this is no cry for redemption in the afterlife. This is not a plea for relief in heaven. This is not a shadowy hope in the incarnate Son of God, Messiah Jesus. But we only know all that if we're students of the Scriptures. But man, Job's plaintive cries? And for chapter after chapter, extended poetic speech piled on top of extended poetic speech, the principle of retribution is laid out, reworked, reasserted, reiterated. After all, retribution, the ancients believed with all their hearts, they thought retribution was woven into the fabric of the universe. And those three wise friends were certain Job had sinned. And Job is certain that he hadn't done anything to deserve such a boatload of suffering. The retribution principle is, in fact, Job argues, not just. Job is saying God's not working as he should. God's being a mean old ogre. This is all on God, not me, says Job. That's some pretty big themed stuff. That's stuff that I think is important for us that I'm going to unpack in later shows. And that's not all that I'm going to say about suffering or retribution by any stretch. But by noting the book's human speeches, by having seen how common and deeply ensconced in the minds and hearts of the ancients the retribution principle was, we will move toward contemporary application and meaning in later episodes. I want today to cover two other figures in the book that are of some concern for contemporary believers, Behemoth and Leviathan. Behemoth, chapter 40, Leviathan shows up in chapter 41. And these are two creatures that appear through the speech of God himself. And we'll get to those two monsters, those two creatures in a moment. But before that, I wouldn't, indeed couldn't, produce this weekly podcast without the encouragement, prayers, and fiscal support of my monthly supporters. Through their pledges, and you guys, those pledges range anywhere from $2 per month on up. I'm grateful for every one of them at Patreon. $50, $10, $20, $5, they all add up. They all encourage me. But without that strength, without that support, I wouldn't have the wherewithal to keep pumping out shows. So please consider prayerfully joining the subversive team at Patreon, Patreon. My true thanks. Near the end of the book, after all those speeches, God issues a long response to a now finally muted and humbled Job. Beginning in chapter 38, the Lord begins to unpack for us a very complicated picture. The gist of which basically says, Job, you don't understand my creation. You don't understand how I've wired things. And worse, you have no ability or idea how to impose justice upon my creation. You challenge me about justice, but you are clueless as to what that even means. And along with that, you don't understand all the forces at work on planet Earth that interact with one another and affect life. For instance, God says, Job doesn't understand all the manner of God-created contingencies at work in life. Job doesn't understand contingencies like how God laid the foundations of the earth and set the boundaries for the oceans. Chapter 38, verses 4 through 11. Job doesn't understand how God established and manages the weather. Chapter 38, verses 22 through 30. And Job cannot possibly understand the nature of animals and their ways, like lions, chapter 38, verses 39 through 41. Mountain goats, chapter 39, wild asses, chapter 39. And no, by noting wild asses, God was not referencing politicians. But God goes on to recount to Job oxen and horses and hawks, none of which he says, do you even understand? And then God really ups the ante. At God's speech crescendo, he describes for Job two figures, Behemoth, chapter 40, Leviathan, chapter 41, two figures that pop up in discussions by today's 21st century believers. What's God say about Behemoth? Well, he says in chapter 40 that it lives on the land, eats grass, has its strength in its loins and its power in the muscles of its belly, has a stiff tail like a cedar tree, and bones like bronze. It lives in the mountains, but swims in the wadis and the rivers. Now, vivid to the ancient mind, God says, Behemoth is so wild that it cannot be captured with hooks or snares. That's all in chapter 40. And then, how's God go about describing Leviathan? Well, in chapter 41, we learn God says it lives in the sea. It cannot be caught with a fish hook, snared with a rope, pierced with a hook, beaten with a club, or speared by javelins. There's really no way to capture it. Not even the pagan gods can snare it. It breathes flames out of its mouth and boiling hot smoke from its nose. It can crush iron into straw with its mouth. It has a double coat of armor, a back of shields, and a heart made of stone. And God concludes his description of Leviathan by saying about it, on earth it has no equal. It is a creature without fear. And it surveys everything that is lofty. It is king over all that are proud. Chapter 41, verse 34. King over all the proud? Surveying all the lofty? That sounds like God. So, wow. Two strange animals. What kind of animals are these? Well, Behemoth, a common, now traditional answer is God was describing a hippo. But a hippo? A heart of stone? Really? The gods are scared by a hippo? A creature without equal? How about an elephant? A heffalump? Come on, man. There's no living land creature that fulfills God's descriptions here, so what is this? And what about Leviathan? Well, the traditional answer is that it's a crocodile, but God describes it more like an underwater smog dragon from The Hobbit than an actual sea animal, swamp animal. Flames out of its mouth? Hot smoke from its nose? It can't be captured? Goodness, men actually are capable of hooking and landing whales, but they can't do that to Leviathan? So, over the years, some Christians have come to think that God is describing some kind of a dinosaur here, a brontosaurus. But dinosaurs didn't live when people did. So why would God describe creatures to Job, which means why would God describe creatures to us, the readers? Why would God describe creatures like that if they weren't alive? So it's good to ask, what in the name of zoology is going on here? Bazinga. That's it. This ancient book isn't describing zoology. Nope. It is unpacking theology. The Bible, for all of its life-changing truth, is not a science book. It is every single page a theology book. It is constantly pressing, always trying to inform us about its divine author, God. And so these two creatures don't come from zoology, but they do draw upon other ancient literature and forms that the Hebrews would have been familiar with. And that broader historical milieu, it shows us, scholars Walton and Longman inform us, that these are chaos creatures. Behemoth and Leviathan represent forces of chaos at work in life. So, in that sense, we're on sturdy ground to think of them kind of like dragons. Most of the world, most cultures imagine dragons and realize that they're chaos creatures. Me? I have a relative who has a dragon tattoo, and it represents his battle with addictions, his battle with existential chaos. In Lord of the Rings, dragons are chaos creatures. And the dragon in the Bible, elsewhere, is indeed a chaos creature. So these images portray, in the ancient mind, and hopefully now ours as readers, both non-order and or disorder. So it's good to know some historical background there, what those symbols would have represented in the ancient world. But as helpful as that historical background is, the immediate deal, Walton and Longman say, these Old Testament scholars say, the immediate deal is how the author uses Behemoth and Leviathan within the book's scope. And when we come to these two animals, these two creatures in God's speech with Job, the entire level of conversation changes. Earlier in the book, Job had posited his own righteousness as a basis for questioning God's justice, chapter 40, verse 8. So Behemoth is recalled by God to say to Job, Job, dude, you're not righteous enough to question me. And besides, you have no idea how to impose my justice upon the world. So with Behemoth, God is saying, Job, you've overstepped your bounds. Your accusation against me is unwarranted. Behemoth is not righteous, nor can he be controlled. And then, similarly with Leviathan. Leviathan, we recall in chapter 41, verse 34, looks down on the lofty and is king over all who are proud. You guys, this is subtle, but it's important. By referencing Leviathan and saying this, God is telling Job, you don't even compare to Leviathan. You have no right to look down on people. And once again, my first creation, Job, man, you think that you yourself could tame my preeminent creature, Leviathan? You're nuts. And likewise, you think you can tame me, manipulate me, Yahweh? Pshaw. And get this, you guys, during the first 8 verses of chapter 41 about Leviathan, God used the second person, you. He's saying, Job, you cannot snare, hook, bind, or even play with Leviathan. If you even tried to lay hands on it, you'll realize you're playing with fire and you'll never try it again. Chapter 41, verse 8. So just as you cannot snare, hook, bind, pin down, or manipulate Leviathan, you also cannot do that to me, Yahweh. Oh, and all of that's so easy for we 21st century denizens to miss. We're reading the book for our own reasons, with our own questions from our own worldview. But the ancients would have read it and thought, yikes, I guess we better not mess with God, presume we know what God knows, or presume that we understand God's justice. And let me say those again because they're central to the book's purpose. We better not A, mess with God, B, presume we know what God knows, or C, presume that we understand God's justice. And what's the takeaway from all that? Life on planet Earth is not based on the retribution principle. That old Wisdom 101, that karmic law, to put it into extra biblical categories, that old karmic law of sowing and reaping is actually not a one-for-one, even though it is almost everywhere assumed to be a one-for-one. So God is telling Job, hey, in truth, life is complicated. There are forces of non-order and even disorder which play into events, circumstances, situations, contingencies. The book wants us to be deliberate. The author of Job wants us to be slow to blame people for their circumstances, as if they always brought it on themselves. And we need to be wise not to assume God is wreaking justice or punishment or resolution in people's lives based on the retribution principle. The book of Job is saying life is complicated. There are forces of non-order and even disorder which play into events and circumstances and contingencies. And amazingly, that's precisely what Jesus shows when he's pressed as to why suffer. And I'm going to begin our next study of Job with just that, Jesus, on the topic of suffering. For now, thank you for listening. No, even better, thanks for thinking. Please go now and turn your beautiful God-given brains on, everybody.